train from central London. It's a leafy commuter town that attracts many first-time buyers. I should know, I was one of them. In 1984, I bought my first house on this very road. It's just gone on the market. Roughly how much would it be?
I mean, this one's just come onto the market at 275,000.
Estate agent Carl Gable has worked this patch for many years. Well, let's walk up the hill and see where I used to live.
Okay.
Because it's just 100 yards up here. And it was the first house I bought in 1984, so we're talking about 28 years ago. And it's rather odd because there is a precise mathematical acceleration here. I bought my cottage up here for 27,500, and that's just got on the market for 275,000.
Yeah, absolutely.
So about 10 times more in 28 years.
Incomes certainly haven't gone up that much, have they?
We bought this little place here.
That's a pretty little cottage, isn't it?
Yeah, it is lovely. It was 3 times either my salary or my wife's salary.
Yeah.
So for us, it wasn't too difficult.
Absolutely.
With no deposit. I wouldn't say it felt cheap, but I never felt under financial pressure, whereas I'm guessing these kids today, they're coming into this marketplace, they must feel really stretched.
They're stretching themselves. You know, all it takes is for somebody to, lose their job and they're in real financial difficulty, aren't they?
Most lenders agree that a prudent house buyer should pay not much more than 3 times salary. But with the average house price now £161,000 and average earnings stuck at £26,000, the maths are stacked against those trying to get on the housing ladder. Little wonder that the average age of a first-time buyer has risen to 37. Britain's population has increased by more than 10% in the last 30 years, but house building has not kept pace.
So there's an increasing bifurcation between 2 different groups of young people. Those who can get help from their parents probably own a house themselves, can either help now or there's an expectation of a inheritance in the future. And those whose parents don't have that kind of wealth now or in the future. And that second group, I think it's a real issue in terms of social mobility. It's a real issue in terms of their lifetime welfare because the housing ladder is being taken further away from them.
That doesn't sound good. But what about the other end of life's conveyor belt? When Britain's universal pension system was set up, life expectancy was much shorter than today. Workers would reach retirement age, if lucky, enjoy a few years of genteel pursuits, and then pass on. It's not like that now. These guys are known as the Silver Surfers. They're fit, they're active, and they plan to be drawing their inflation-protected pensions for many years yet. Even though you're working as well, is yours a final salary scheme?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones, the last scarp of the final salary pensions. I feel embarrassed almost that having lived this long, but that's how it is. I am worried about my kids, and I really do. And partly I work because I still enjoy it, but partly I work to build up something extra to pass on to them, because I know they're not going to be as lucky as I was.
Beyond the public sector, final salary pensions have largely disappeared. But, unlike the tide on Tynemouth Beach near Newcastle, they won't be coming back. The industry's rule of thumb for occupational pensions is that for every £1,000 of annual withdrawal, there has to be £16,000 in the pot. For the born bankrupt generation, the challenge of saving for a £25,000 a year pension will be enormous. The pot will need to be £400,000. Try accumulating that while repaying a student loan and grappling with a mortgage and higher taxes. The irony here is that the big plus of increased life expectancy has become a significant minus for retirement funds. On current trends, there will be a 50% increase in the number of over 65s by 2030. As the OAP population soars, the danger is that today's pension promises will impoverish tomorrow's taxpayers. Money in, money out, just won't match up. It does sound like a Ponzi scheme.
It is a bit like a Ponzi scheme. If you keep promising this generation more on the basis the next generation will be richer, if the next generation carries on forever and ever and ever being richer, then that kind of works, as long as the sizes of the generations are all right as well. One of the problems, of course, is the generation of baby boomers is big. It's a smaller generation coming on behind. That means they have to pay additional amounts per person to support the bigger, older generation.
Writer Sheev Malik, co-author of The Jilted Generation, says it's time we took a long, hard look at the burdens we are imposing on young people.
The bomb will go off with this generation, i.e. the generation of sort of adults now, between those ages, sort of 18, 19 to about 32. Hopefully, therefore, it'll be solved somewhat for that younger generation.
What do you mean by the bomb will go off?
The bomb of both debt, of the housing crisis in this country, the problem of income, essentially, for young people, and therefore, real income after taxes, because if you're paying off state debt, you're going to be doing that largely through taxes. I think these problems are going to come to a head far earlier, in the next 10 years, where we're going to have to find long-term solutions.
A former Home Secretary once said to me about the pensions crisis, it will never be resolved in my lifetime because it requires those in government to ask a sacrifice of the current generation of voters for benefits down the line, and we simply don't have the political courage to do that because they'll vote us out. So we are not going to fix the pensions crisis in this country because there is no political will.
Well, I mean, what a terrible indictment of a generation, really. The leaders of that generation have been just atrocious. I mean, look at, sort of what really is their legacy. Their legacy is passing on a whole load of debt, having a consumer boom that was very short-lived and not investing. So they failed on that intergenerational contract, absolutely.
The problem for politicians is that voters rarely support a policy of paying today for someone else's benefits many years later. But without tough measures, the crunch may come sooner than we think. When you add all this up, there's going to be what you describe as a pinch point. Some would say it's the moment when the seams start to split. You're saying 2030. Why 2030?
It's when the baby boom generation encounter their time of kind of maximum dependency, not just with pensions, but probably in need of other forms of care as well. If the baby boomers don't offer a fair deal now to the younger generation are not going to be willing to pay their taxes to sustain us, the baby boomers, in our old age. And that's why one of my most important arguments to baby boomers is the one on the bumper sticker on the American car. Be nice to your kids, they choose your nursing home.
Well, if this lot ends up picking our nursing homes, one can only be fearful. Rightly or wrongly, they feel betrayed. And here's why. It's perfectly possible, is it not, that the current generation will be worse off than their parents?
Well, actually, we're already seeing that. For the first time ever, the current generation of people in their 20s are less well off than the last generation of people at that age. And for all of the reasons that we've discussed, there is reason to believe that that may persist for some time through their lives, both in terms of their earnings and their employment levels and because of the taxes that they'll have to pay.
Do you think economic historians in years to come will look back on the noughties, the years, say, 2000, 2010, and conclude that was the decade when the sort of core adults really let rip? That was the irresponsible generation.
I think some people will clearly look at these issues in terms of the responsibility of the generation. I think others will look at it and say, is this really about a nation adjusting to the fact that it's going to be poorer in future than it had anticipated when making these sorts of plans in the past, for which individuals presumably bear some responsibility and governments as well, and that we're really adjusting to that.
But are we adjusting fast enough? With state and household debts forecast to carry on increasing sharply, official figures suggest otherwise. Even if the economy puts on a growth spurt, our huge borrowings will bear down on future generations for years.
Both sides of this generational imbalance know that something's going wrong. The kids know that they're facing a very tough future. The parents worry about the tough future that they're leaving to their kids. Sadly, there hasn't been the political resolve to do something about it. Politicians have been too focused on short-term horse trading over what measures do we need to deliver economic growth in the next quarter, instead of thinking about what we need for the next quarter of a century.
So aren't the moral and political issues here this, that the people who inevitably are going to pick up the bills, they don't have a vote on this? They are either not yet born or too young to vote, and they're going to be completely stuffed.
Here's the con. If you're a politician, you want to promise everything you can to people on the electoral register. The best way to do that is to send the bill to people who aren't on the electoral register. If you are under the age of 18 or not yet born, you are not on the electoral register. That's what we've done, frankly, for years. It's morally outrageous. It's unforgivable. We are voting ourselves rich, frankly, knowing full well that it's going to be children and grandchildren who pick up this tab. It is appalling. And I wonder whether one of the fault lines in the future of British politics will actually not be about class, won't be about religion, it will be about what generation you've come from.
Saddled with the baggage of spendthrift forefathers, prospects for the born bankrupt generation really are a crying shame. Our old friend Disraeli said that real statesmen think of the next generation, whereas politicians care only about the next election. Looking back on Britain's explosion of debt in the first decade of this century, it's hard not to conclude that what masqueraded as economic policy here inside the Treasury was just mortgaging the future of those too young to vote. The money has all been spent, but the debt is still rising.